So what else? What are some of the other questions that we're getting from people? One of the questions I see has to do with passage of time
Hmm.
and time limits and sort of that sort of playing off of what we're talking about in terms of being intentional about it. Um, a lot of the kids in our community in particular really struggle with time management. Most kids, let's be honest, struggle with time management. So, and I think parents are particularly concerned right now, because now that school's on the screen, like what do we mean by screen time and what's an appropriate amount of time for screen time? How do you want to
Well, and even
think about
just
that?
generally, how do you approach limits? And so I think that's where I think I'd like to start this conversation is how do you even approach evaluating or setting limits around screen time? Because again, this is a restart. So we have an opportunity to kind of go, okay, we're having school from home right now, or I'm having work from home right now. How do we approach setting limits? So how would you get someone started there, Elaine?
So, to me, in the work that we do, we talk about taking aim, right? And we get really clear. And so, what you're taking aim on is we as a family want to have some expectations that we all agree upon about technology or how much time we're going to spend on technology. And and I think that the next step is to get curious. And so there's this opportunity for us as the parents to show some leadership and not to come in and say, okay, here's what it's going to be, but to start with a conversation like you were saying at dinner with our kids about what do we use the screen for? Like one of the conversations we have in the summit is with Elizabeth Milovodov, who has this cool conversation starters for parents to have with their
Yeah.
kids around technology, right? And it's a really great idea to she sort of poses some questions for you to sort of talk about at the dinner table. So I think one really key place to start is to get curious about what they think and what they think is important and what their values are around it are. No judgment. Don't start by imposing limits. Start by even asking the question, so do you think there should be limits on screen time for any of us? And you might be surprised they might think that there should be for us, right?
Yeah.
So that's really where I would always start is to understand, take the temperature of the lay of the land a little bit and get a sense of where they're coming from.
Well, and I think that enables you to approach the limits in a very different way, because if you come in and say, we need to have limits, or these are the limits, it's a very different conversation than if you start with, do you think we should have limits? And then their first answer might be no, no, no. And I'm like, well, wait a second. Does that mean that when you're in the bathtub that it's okay to whatever, or what if it's 2 a.m. and I'm supposed to be sleeping and I can't wake up to get you to school on time, would that be okay? And you can kind of talk about what may or may not be okay for you, because I think your kids are going to have a stronger opinion about what limits maybe you should have. It's easier to talk about somebody else's limits than it is to talk about your own. And so that might be a place to start, is just generally, well, what should the limits be for me?
Well, what I love that is to start by asking the question. Okay, we're going to talk about time limits or time limits or boundaries or whatever around technology. We're going to start with me.
What should my limits be?
What should I? Because that will surprise them. That will throw them off, and it will open up a conversation in a very different way because it won't put them on the defensive. And the key here is to avoid language that sounds blaming and judging. I've been saying for the last week the weird thing about this phone thing is that we parents have been demonizing them for years, and
Right.
now all of a sudden they're our lifeline.
Yeah.
And so it's a brilliant opportunity for us as parents to flip it a little bit and allow us to be the model, to start with us instead of starting with them, and keep it from being a defensive conversation, but just kind of get really curious about, wow, how do we want to do this now?